This is a conversation between Delmar Rouse of Elmira, New York, and Ted Belsky of the AIC Oral History Center. The conversation is taking place at the Chemung County Historical Society, and we're meeting in pursuit of to discuss some of the themes that came out in the Black History Oral Project. Del, want to thank you very, very much for making yourself available, and also to say what a pleasure it is to have a chance to meet and interact with you. I'm aware, because I just listened last night to a copy of the tape between yourself and Nellie Jennings, and so a lot of the biographical questions that I might be raising in an interview like this, I'm going to omit because that's already part of the record.
Very good.
What I'd like us to do, if you don't mind, ask the Elmira you grew up in, with the Elmira today, and to talk about how it got that way, and maybe reflect on some areas that are still left to address. But if we might, Del, when were you born, and I want to place you in Elmira when you were about 8, 10, 12 years old. So you've got to give me the dates and the place.
All right. I was born March 8th, 1938, St. Joseph's Hospital. March 8th, 1938, St. Joseph's Hospital here in Elmira. And I grew up on what's known as the east side of Elmira, on East Avenue, which the home or the house that I was living in, that my parents were living in, that was no longer there due to the flood of 1946 and 47.
Mm-hmm.
And the project that came in to help control future flooding, they bought my parents' property, and we moved from that location to another location on the east side, which is on J Street, which is still, I was about 9 years old at that time. Okay.
That would be a great place for us to stop and take a look at what the Elmiran community was like to grow up in for a young black male like yourself, interested in life. And
Well, I think when other people look at your life, it might sound more interesting, or appear to be more interesting than perhaps it might be. Back at that time, the Elmira community, from the eyes of a 9 or 10 year old kid,
yeah, right,
was fairly segregated as where you lived, went to school, and socialized.
Yeah.
The incidents of open prejudice wasn't as bad as to a kid as maybe some adults might have felt at that
Sure.
time. Okay. The other fascinating part about the east side of Elmira, that for the most part, it's always been a racially mixed segment of our community.
Mm-hmm.
So that in addition to a lot of the minorities, most of the minorities who lived in the city lived on the east side at that time. Also, the middle low whites also lived in that part of the community. It was a time when there was a transition taking place where primarily the Jewish population of our community began to migrate from the east side of Elmira toward, which is a separate kind of community. But at that time, that transition was going on, and a lot of the stores and shops that were in the east side part of the community were owned by the Jewish population.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Their children went to school with us, and whatever have you. So it was not necessarily an uncomfortable existence for a kid.
Sure.
Okay. My dad worked at the General Electric Foundry. I had been for quite a while, and he also worked for the city as a garbage collector. So he had the two jobs. Almost all of my life, I remember him working these two jobs. All of my life, I remember him working these two jobs.
Did it take two jobs to get by?
Well, from my folks, it did. They had their own goals, which, you know, looking back and having talked with them, that kind of, I realize now, of course I didn't at the time, that, they wanted their children to have a better opportunity than they had.
Yeah.
And they saw that the minimum to do that would be to be sure that at least, no, I'll have to correct it. From my father's, no, I'll have to correct it. From my father's point of view, at least his son should have a college education. My mother's point of view is that all of us should have an education. Okay? And Dad eventually agreed because my sisters wanted an education.
Sure.
Okay? And so that was their overall motivation. Okay?
Yeah.
So they worked toward that end. And today all four of us have our college educations. Okay? And we all early on and have continued because
Sure.
it took all of that to get four of us, because the four children chronologically, my youngest sister, the youngest one in the family,
Yeah.
is just a little over 4 years younger than I am. Okay?
Yeah.
So when I was going into college, theoretically,
Yes.
okay, but because of how we had to stagger some things, there was 1 year that all four of us was in college at the same time. Okay? And for a black family back in the 50s and 60s, that
Yeah.
was no easy feat, and to open up educational avenues for
Yes.
people, and but we made it happen, and
Del, in your tape with Billy Jennings, that
Mhm.
came out very clear. The degree to which going to college was a high priority that you took on very, very early.
Mhm.
And I gather.
Well, we got that from the motivation from our parents.
Yeah.
My dad, I think you probably heard on the tape, came up from Georgia at age 14. Okay? His mother was already up here, but he had been raised up to that point by his grandmother. And he's never gone back. He never wanted to go back to Georgia. My mother was from South Carolina.
Yeah.
From a large family. My dad was an only child. So, in terms of numbers of people in our family in the Elmira community, it was not that large. My father had a first cousin who lived next door to us,
Mm-hmm.
who also had 4 children. And all 4 of them also have college educations. So, back in the 60s, early 60s, because I graduated in February 61.
Mm-hmm.
The 2 families graduated in that period, 8 kids. Okay, and my cousin, Detroit. In fact, he just spoke here in Elmira for a function here. But that was kind of unheard of during that time in this community. And
Yes.
I don't want to overplay it, but for this community, I felt that was quite an achievement. Okay, you see young people with a lot of free time or doing some other kinds of things. Ours was occupied by finding work and doing the work and taking care of each other, because my mother left to go to nursing school. Well, after we all 4 were born, we were all in school, get her LPN
Yes.
training. And then after receiving her training, she worked there for a while before coming back to Elmira. And she eventually became the first licensed practical
Sure.
nurse, black nurse, to work at St. Joseph's Hospital in this community. Okay? Okay? But that tells you a little bit about our motivation from a family point
Yeah.
of view. My family also were extremely religious. And that in itself placed a lot of controls on our activity and our involvement in the community. Controls on our activity and our involvement in the community. So you take that plus the working that was required for us to
Yeah.
get through, to meet our own goals. We lived a fairly controlled life back then. Okay.
Del, which
Back then. Okay.
what was the church that your family attended?
It's called All Saints Home Church of God in Christ. It's now located on 5th and Dickinson Streets.
Mm-hmm.
My grandparents are charter members of it. And my father has been a deacon in the church. Has been a deacon in the church for years and years and years. In fact, now they still have him listed as the chairman of the deacon board in kind of an emeritus status.
Sure.
It started out as a small mission kind of church, and the new church, which was built in the the 60s. But all that came out of that growth period back in.
Friends at the time, growing up.
Well, most of my friends were the young people that were in the church that we were in, the kids that we went to school with.
Yeah.
Okay, and the kids that lived in your immediate neighborhood. Now, yeah, the East Side has several ways that it's looked at. Madison Avenue is. Okay. Madison Avenue runs north and south.
Yeah.
So I'm reflecting now primarily for those who live in the minority. That area, if you looked on Madison Avenue to the east of it, was referred to as the Hollow.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Generally east side of Madison Avenue, going from like Water Street all the way, up. Okay.
Bill, straighten something out for me.
Mhm.
You just mentioned the Hollow.
Right. And then there's Uptown.
No, but then there was East Side, and then there was Shantytown.
Yeah. Well, they're.
Are
Okay.
they, to what degree are they the same area? To what degree? Are
The
they
east
different?
side and the Hollow. All depends on how you want to define the east side.
Okay.
In the minds of the east side.
Okay.
In the minds of those of us who grew up on the east side.
Yes. And that's what I want.
Yeah,
Right.
you could probably take the, say like, what's now Clemens Boulevard,
Yeah.
with Clemens Boulevard,
Yeah.
east of that, which could
Okay.
be generally considered the east side.
Yeah.
Okay. The Hollow, you take Madison Avenue east.
I see.
Okay.
Okay.
And then there's a third term called Frog Hollow. Okay.
Okay.
And then there's a third term called Frog Hollow.
Yeah.
Now you would take and you run a east and west line at, say like at Sullivan and Church.
Okay.
Okay. And go south of that, or down towards where Kennedy Valve is, in that direction. Towards where Kennedy Valve is, in that direction.
I think I know where that is.
Kennedy Valve's right across the street from, where the Holiday Inn is down
Yeah.
here, and then there's a factory down at the
Yeah.
end just before you go out on the
Okay,
that's Kennedy Valve.
okay.
So the further east and the further toward that direction you went, the deeper in the hollow, and the further toward that direction you went, the deeper in the hollow you came. You
see.
went.
Okay.
So that one area then would be Frog Hollow when you were way down there, and it could be called Shantytown or Frog Hollow, because that was probably the most, for lack of a a more accurate word, but the concept would be like a ghettoized area.
Yeah.
Okay, it wasn't exactly that, but that would be the area where the 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 poorest and the less mobile people in the
Yeah,
community
yeah.
were. Okay, mobile people in the
Yeah,
community
yeah.
were. Okay, although at the same time you had some very solid, very well maintained properties there, intermingled with these
Isn't
other
that
properties.
interesting?
Right.
Yeah.
But that was kind of the way it was when I grew up. And of course,
Right.
Beecher School was the school for most of those who lived in that area, as well as Laganegro School, which
Yeah.
is now the building, which is the Human Services Building. That was the
Right.
school, okay?
Yeah.
So those were the two primary schools that met the educational needs of those who were beginning to travel more east, okay? But at any rate, that would be the kind of verbal picture of the
Sure.
east side of Elmira at that time. There's no way you could visualize it by going out there looking at it now.
It disappeared, I take it, the flood?
Yes, dental, timing, whatever have you, but previous to the advent of the flood,
We're talking the flood of 1972.
okay, the city of Elmira had embarked on an urban renewal program, and this was back in the middle to later 60s,
Sure.
okay? But it was just in the early implementation stages. You know, the plans, the blueprints, and, you know, that kind of thing. And so once the flood actually did take place, having some basic plans and some master thinking already out of the way, it just facilitated, okay, some of the reconstruction following the flood.
Sure.
Okay, because following the flood.
Sure.
Okay, because of the general condition of the east side, they sustained the brunt of the devastation in terms of properties and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So,
Dell, before we leave it,
Mhm.
and of just how enormous that flood was,
yes, it
and
covered 3/4 of the actual city of Elmira
yeah,
was touched by the flood in some
And-
way. I mean, there was water going from the river on both sides all the way up to generally
in the water,
considerable.
without
Yeah. My parents lived on J Street, and they had water on the first floor of their house about 4.5 feet. That's how far from the river house. I had almost 7 feet of water on my first floor. Okay, so that it does
that was one.
defy your imagination just to picture that. But as a result of that, the flood did several things. Physically, it changed the city.
Yes.
In terms of the way it looks. It cleaned it up in terms of taking away the dilapidated housing and the
Yeah.
substandard housing. It also forced a kind of integration
Sure.
of housing and living conditions throughout the community, so that no longer were there a singular pocket of blacks, for example,
Yeah. Yeah.
other than those that existed in housing projects.
Yeah.
DeWittsburg and Eastgate even came after that. You see what I mean?
Sure.
So that there was a general migration from the Lower East Side, generally toward the northeast of the East Side.
Yep.
Okay, and in special areas throughout the rest of the community. Okay, particularly the South Side, which up to that point there were not many minorities living on the east side. There were some, but not an
Yeah.
awful lot. But now that's no longer true. Okay, so the flood itself, coupled with this need, forced
Yep.
these things to happen, and as a result, show the implications, as you could probably picture right away, took place, and we just had a situation where a lot of people had to change their thinking,
Sure.
regardless of what part of the community you came from, okay? And about almost regardless of what kinds of you could no longer allow yourself to consider that I'm from the east side and I had to find all of my activities have to take place on the east side.
Sure.
Because they were there. Well, they were no longer there. So that you had to start meeting his needs regardless of what they were. So that was a situation brought upon us by, in part, nature.
Yeah, yeah. And at a time when Elmira, because it was 72, and we were talking urban planning, was always already part of the agenda, was consciously not going to go back. What it was going to do was to
It was
create
it was not going to ever go back to the way it was.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just the thinking had already changed with respect to that.
I don't want to leave that period of your youth yet.
Okay.
I don't want to leave that period of your youth yet.
Okay.
As you were growing up, what was your own sense of expectation of what you might aspire to as an adult? When you said to yourself, when I grow up, I want to be, or I want to be, or I want to...
I wanted to be a doctor. Now, every kid wanted to be a doctor, I suppose, but I really wanted to be one. And that was the idea that motivated me throughout my high school years, both in terms of my coursework at school, as well as working to help prepare myself for that kind of thing and help my family do it. And when I left to go to college, I went into a pre-med program.
Yeah.
Okay.
Del, when you said that to
Okay.
Del, when you said that to yourself, to what degree did you think, I've got to work that much harder simply because, given the prejudice that's out there, you knew that the normal... Would you describe that thinking? Just
Well,
like that?
that's exactly right, Ted, that right from a kid, with part of the socialization process in your family, you're a black kid, right? You're going to have to be much better than your white counterpart, okay?
Yeah.
And whether it's fair or not is not even an issue. Ironically, that was one of the reasons after I was in college for a year and a half that I decided to change.
Could you explain that?
Well, I found out that living in a small upstate town, city,
Sure.
in itself was very restricted outside world. Your world is kind of restricted here in Elmira, New York. And if you never really get outside of Elmira very much, you have the faintest idea what's going on in other communities. And I elected to go to Alfred University, which is a small upstate college, university rather. But it is one of the favorite universities for most of the young people coming from the metropolitan area. I mean, if you go to Alfred University, even today, most of your students are from the city and the Long Island and your largest communities around the state. City and the Long Island and your largest communities around the state and other, okay?
Yeah.
They want to get away from the city life, okay? So they come up here, all right?
Okay.
So if you come from a small community and then you're suddenly thrust into a peer group, of people who come from a much faster paced life, much better prepared to deal with it than you are, it causes you to do a lot of soul searching and training. Okay, that's what I'm really saying.
Yeah.
That it's not enough to say I'm just going to be a good.
What about the people in the black community that you knew as you were growing up, your friends?
Mm-hmm.
What was their agenda?
Well, survival. The adults that were close to my family were, for the most part, coming from the same kind of religious orientation that my family did. Basically, hardworking people who did not mind going in, well, who went into and
Sure.
put in that hot work, 40 hours, 45 hours a week, whatever it required, and found that if they were willing to do that, they could fashion out a reasonably good
Mm-hmm.
life by their standards.
Yeah,
Okay, by their standards.
yeah.
Okay, uh, and that's pretty much the way they approached it. Most of the younger people who went on to school primarily did it as a result of some type. Primarily did it as a result of some type of athletic scholarship. Okay, there were some exceptions, but primarily
Sure.
that was their route out. And I guess that pretty much would describe generally
Okay.
how I viewed it as a youngster at the time.
Right.
Okay, I look at it a lot different when I reflect back on it, but you know.
Yeah, no.
You asked
I
me
was
to go,
asking
you asked me to go
very
the other
much.
way.
Right.
To go the other way around.
And,
right.
and, I'm
Right,
glad-
yeah.
One last area, though, education, which already got that sense of the family's agenda
Right.
that helped define your goal. You go to school. How open was that school for you? How good was the counseling?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Just right around the corner from where I grew up at.
Yeah.
And it was considered not to be, at that time, one of the better elementary schools, primarily because it was located on the east side.
Yeah.
Although many of us from my own peer group have done quite well.
Yeah.
Coming out of Beecher School. My real problem with the counseling and everything started when I was in the 8th grade and getting ready to go into high school. And I had wanted to go into the academic program in high school. And the counselors tried to dissuade my mother from supporting that idea. And they wanted minority males, but primarily to go into shop programs. And the girls would go into home ec and stuff like that, you know, the watered down kind of thing, which I don't believe is watered down now, but back then that's the way now it was pretty much the way they looked at that time, okay?
Yeah.
But see, they did not plan on having to deal with my mother. There's no way you can say that to her and she will accept that, okay? And she asked him, well, did my grades warrant my being able to do? Then why can't he go in it? That's the way she is. I mean, she
Yeah.
will take it too. So I eventually got it, but we had to go through some changes to make that happen. My brother, who's only he's a year younger than me, school-wise, he was a near Olympian in 1960. Okay, yeah, and he had all these pro football contract offers after college and stuff like that. But my brother loves to work with his hands. I mean, he's got this natural gift.
Yeah.
Okay. To work with his hands. I mean, he's got this natural gift.
Yeah.
Okay. So they put him in these shop programs. And then when he got to high school and started excelling in all of the sports.
You were telling me about your brother.
Yes. As I was saying,
You were telling me about your brother.
Yes. as I was saying, he's a marvelous athlete. He's in the Elmira Hall of Fame and all these other kinds of things. But at any rate, after he was in high school, and I saw his potential athletically, they were the ones then that wanted him then to take on an academic program. That's the kind of thinking
Sure.
it was back then. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, of course, now he has 2 master's degrees and he's teaching and all these other kinds of things. He always was, intelligent.
Yeah.
He just happened to love working with his hands, work as well. So he's doing both. Okay.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that went on. But at any rate, that gives you an indication of the kind of educational system at that time, the way it turned out to be. Now, in terms of simulating the school community, both my brother and I, we had no problems. I dealt with much more than just, I was a one sport man. I needed my letter, so I ran track. I did well there, and I got my letter. But I also sang in all of the musical groups. I served on as a class officer and things like that. Okay, which was very possible even in that atmosphere, because we had another uniqueness in our community. Even though there's an east and a west side that's divided, the high school at that time was located on the east side. So the kids from the west side also had to go to the same high school. Meant for the first time, east side and west side young people had to come together into a new school community.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was an assimilation that had to take place at that point, which for the most part, and during my high school experience back from 52 to 56, was imagination. Other people may not have the same thing. I got along well there because my own personal agenda kept me on course.
Sure.
And I was looking for some other things differently than maybe somebody else was. I needed experience. I needed to know how to function. I needed experience. I needed to know how to function in both worlds, both the minority world, black world, as well as the general. And my thinking from my family's point of view right from the beginning is that you had to master that. And as long as you knew is that you had to master that. And as long as you knew where you were going, no matter what they felt, that's not even an issue. You have to know what your program is, what your agenda was, okay? And that was the kind of thinking I went into. Because when I went to Alfred, I was the only black guy in the whole class coming in, okay, back in 1956.
Doesn't that say
Okay,
something?
so it wasn't a matter of, all these other things that kids are worried about now. If you weren't really focused in on what you were about, see, so.
I was going to ask you about Elmira in the present, but let's save that just a little bit. Along the way, I'd like to identify personal events that had local Elmiran consequences, implications. One was World War World War II. To what degree did the black community participate in World War II?
Well, that's a kind of open-ended question, Ted, because from a community's point of view, because of our industrial base,
Right.
there were a lot of work
Uh-huh.
because a lot of plants were converted to produce war products. In fact, my mother even went into the foundry to work during the wartime.
Is that right?
Foundry to work during the wartime.
Is that right?
Right.
Yeah.
And my father was exempt from actually going to war because he was also already working at General Electric at the time. Okay, so from that point of view, blacks in the community were making a major contribution.
Sure.
Okay, my mother's served in World War II. one in the European theater and the other one in the Pacific theater. Okay. There were a lot of local black men who served in the armed forces. You can go, you can find anyone in that age of military experience based, based on that time. So I think that the war did have an impact on our community.
To be honest, part of the reason I asked the question
Mhm.
was I was wondering what changed employment patterns and employment expectations for the black community, and it occurred to me that World War II might have been a major...
Well, it just, it really kind of created for those blacks that were already here, the need
Sure.
and the fact that we were an industrially based community and we had these foundries that could put out these products that was needed. So that opened up the door. Now, shortly after it was over, I could remember my father talking about when it was over, that they didn't make any real progress within the industries.
Yeah.
Okay? It's inconceivable to work 35 or 40 years in the plant and never really grow in terms of responsibility other than what you're doing. Becoming foremen or special technicians. Those things happen very late. And some of them are still not happening. Well, of course, GE's closed now. But my father had been there for a lot of years. And he finally got to a point where he was a technician in terms of mixing sand and stuff like that. And he finally got to a point where he was a technician in terms of mixing sand and stuff like that. But this was a very intelligent person whose own personal goal was to eventually be a lawyer. Okay, he was one of the top students coming out of Beecher's School. After coming up here from the South, out of Beecher's School. After coming up here from the South. Okay, but that was cut short for him. But then he goes and he spends all these years in the plant, and nobody picks up on his potential and allows him to maximize or even to use it beyond medium level.
When did that transition begin to take place in Elmira? Where it began with the opening up of jobs because there was such a need for people for the industrial production. When did management jobs? When did...
I cannot pinpoint like a year, a time, or a date, but it was in the 70s.
That way.
Yeah. There's a man, well,
Sure.
he's one of the first foreman level people at KV. Yeah.
Is that...
There was an older gentleman, a guy by the name of Watkins, who'd been there a lot of years, but he I think attained that career there. But if you wanted to follow that up, you could talk to either Wilma or Leo, because they would be more accurate as to time. But it was Leo is younger than I am in terms of Leo is maybe 3 or 4 years, 3 years younger than I am. He was like a sophomore when I was a senior in high school, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And he went almost straight from school to that plant. I think he tried college for a year or something like that. But and even with that, it took him that long to reach a point where he could assume any kind of management level, mid-management. Well, that's just mid-management level responsibility.
Was there anybody in the black community who took on that role of trying to confront the business of...
Yeah. We have a man by the name of Frank Givens, who was a engineer at KV, and as I understand it, and I don't know all the specifics, he had a very tough time reaching that level. But but we had, you know, the NACP tried to put pressure on those kinds of problems, try to bring it, make it public.
Yeah.
And then to begin to develop some strategies to, and then we had some younger group of people who within the community tried to band together to put some pressure on various systems throughout this community to recognize other, you know, there's potential here that's untapped,
Yep.
and that could be very helpful to be used by the community. But primarily, we just had the NACP from an official point of view. You would have some of the ministers would try to get in and do some of that work on a more individual basis. But that was something that's hard to evaluate the success of that. A lot of one-on-one kinds of things with respect to that.
Let me try another. To what extent were you aware, or let me rephrase, at what time were you aware, or let me rephrase, at what time point did you get to be aware of the bus strike? And I'm thinking of Martin Luther King and Alabama, and the start of that, conscious decision to take on and revamp the ground rules.
Well, and for me, it happened in a real way in the early 60s. This was the major marches and whatever have you.
Yeah.
But there were already efforts being made on a national level. National mean coming out of, you know, Washington and like that, to put it up, you know, to desegregate their schools. Unfortunately for me, I was a troop. I was in the Army at that time.
Yeah.
And when I got back from Germany in '62, I was reassigned to Fort Benning, Georgia. We were alerted to go to Alabama, my unit.
Uh-huh.
And I went to Alabama because Wallace was trying to prevent.
Yeah.
Okay, I was one of the troops sent to go in there. Okay, I was put on alert and we left Georgia. Went to Fort McClellan. Okay, I was put on alert and we left Georgia. Went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, in readiness for what they expected to take place there, which was a very crude awakening for a northern kid, black kid,
Yeah.
young man at that time, because I had been out of college and I spent, young man at that time, because I had been out of college and I spent some time in Germany, and but before I went to Germany, I was in Arkansas. Arkansas in 1961 was not a place for a black man to be, troop or otherwise. Troop or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I personally experienced those kinds of things, and I saw the hate. Okay, I saw how people can use other people when it's to their. In Germany, were the ones that we came back together in Georgia because we came as a unit.
Sure. Yeah.
And in the military, most of your lifetime soldiers are Southern people.
Yeah.
And to see their attitude change from the way it was in Germany to when they got back home was just absolutely brilliant in itself.
Could you think of some individual person in the unit who kind of exemplified that, so that there would be, in other words, I was wondering How did it affect his behavior? To what degree did he suddenly give new expression to?
Yeah,
Yeah.
the relationship between a black person and his counterpart just changed. I mean, it was almost like a tangible change. Just changed. I mean, it was almost like a tangible change.
Really?
In Germany, I was in Germany because of the Berlin crisis.
Yeah.
So we were in a semi-wartime situation. We couldn't even walk out of the barracks without steel pots on and the whole bit. Okay?
Yeah.
Out of the barracks without steel pots on and the whole bit. Okay?
Yeah.
So we all felt at any moment we were going to get called into Lebanon and stuff like that, or into Berlin.
Yeah.
So our lives depend on each other. And that's what you felt in Germany.
Yeah.
When we got back to Georgia, that particular threat was not in place. They were on their home turf. I'm in their land.
Yeah.
Now you can picture what was happening. Okay, then we get on full alert. We go into Georgia. I don't know how familiar you are with Georgia. It's the largest community to Fort Benning. And I was living there with my wife. So when I got back to the state, I said her.
Yeah.
And so we were living in the city of Columbus. Got alerted one day to go out to the base. And when I got to the base, all the open back vehicles were being covered with chicken wire. And I don't know what's going on here. Okay? Now, my job in the service, I was an operations specialist. I ran the headquarters stuff. I mean, I took care of all the things in the company. So I wasn't in a say.
Mm-hmm.
Although my formal training as far as the military was concerned was exactly that. But when they found out I was a college graduate,
Sure.
they used my skills differently, okay?
Yeah.
But at any rate, the reason why that they were putting this wire around these open back vehicles was to protect us from Columbus to Phoenix, Arizona, which is right over the bridge. It's like going over the bridge from south side to north side. And there were people lined up on both sides of the road all the way in, throwing, spitting, I mean, it was just horrendous. And those guys that were in Germany with me, who were from the south, was just as concerned and fearful as we were, because they were in the exact same situation. We're representing the United States, not our southern homeland, or I'm not a black man concerned about being able to take a position because I am black and this is for my people. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm government because I am black and this is for my people. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm government. I'm here because the government says I had to be here and I had to perform a specific function. Okay? And they have the same thing, only on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And they have the same thing, only on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And here we are together. I mean, it was a really crazy kind of experience. But that's what happened. I lived through that, and I saw it. And, of course, that experience really shaped my thinking when I came back home at the end of 63.
Did it make you more optimistic or less optimistic?
No, it made me want to fight for a change in the community. But I came back and I started doing my social work then as part of my job. But I got formulated a little newsletter kind of thing called The Key, which we made an attempt to keep our people more informed as to what was going on and where they could make some changes or some contributions to help change take place and stuff like that. We published that for a little while. Doing some of it here.
Let me touch on the national firmament, and then I'll want to back off and look at Elmira. Do you remember where you were when you heard about President Kennedy's death?
I was at a welfare conference. Yeah.
His death.
I was at a welfare conference in Rochester, and it ended the conference. We were on a lunch break, And we were walking in the streets when the word came down, and just like the whole world stopped there for a while, you know. Word came down, and just like the whole world stopped there for a while, you know. And of course, that's where I was. Very vivid in my mind. You know.
Can you remember where you were when you heard about Martin Luther King's assassination?
Well, I was in Elmira, but I don't know exactly where I was at the time I heard it. Can't remember that as clearly. Now, that's strange, but I can't remember as clearly. Because it wasn't.
Yeah. Can you remember the?
Because I had met Dr. King.
Had you?
Oh yeah, in New York. At the Delmar Hotel in New York at a conference. Prior to that.
That same year? Or?
No, I think that was like in 60.
Well, not too far before. What was the feeling within the black community?
Well, it was reflective of what you probably read about nationally. I mean, there was disbelief, anger. There was a sense of again, something being taken away for no reason. And it's interesting that as I recall it, it was a very similar sentiment expressed as when Malcolm X was killed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It starts out that one person should take another person's life, number one. It starts out that one person should take another person's life, number one. But the way it's done, even though Malcolm was killed by one of his own, or
sure.
in a sense one of his own.
Yeah.
The thing is that a special person with special qualities, with a recognized mission has been stopped. And where do you go from here? That kind of thing, you know. Who is qualified? Who has the capability to carry the mantle?
Mm-hmm.
Number one, to pick up that mantle.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of them tried, okay, but nobody did. So that there was a major loss, and there was just no way. And you felt that almost immediately. I mean, it wasn't a thing that you came to realize. I mean, boom, there's nobody out there that can handle this. For the younger people like myself at the time, it was that kind of thinking, that kind of anger,
Mm-hmm.
and because you have to, if you take that time period and you see the number of leaders that were taken away from our and you see the number of leaders that were taken away from our community, our country,
Mm-hmm.
not community, our country. I mean, you start with President Kennedy, you know, Robert,
Yeah.
Malcolm, Dr. King. I mean, all of a sudden here, what's going on in this community? I mean, in our country. I mean, are we all of a sudden here? What's going on in this community? I mean, in our country. I mean, are we literally going crazy? I mean, you just, somebody you don't like, you just, you know, you don't care if he's president, okay? A nonviolent leader. See, that gave that gave a lot more credence to the feeling that if you'll do this to somebody who has not shown in any way,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
okay, to be violent or to embrace it.
By the museum.
Mm-hmm.
Was an area was a period in which Elmira was trying to address that a black agenda and recognizing the need to bring about change.
Mm-hmm.
There was and you were very much involved with that.
Well, I was involved just from the viewpoint of a human service worker in the community at that time, and I was aware of what was going on. Of course, that whole busing issue
Yeah.
was never one that was completely embraced by either side, either community. Uh, it was almost like trying to legislate against segregation. You can't do it,
Yeah.
in other words. But busing was asking you to try.
Yeah.
And there were a lot of people who felt exactly that way. Okay? And it kind of thing. And I think there's been some positive outgrowth from it.
Yeah.
In 1968, there weren't that many people who were looking that far ahead to see that there would be, a lot of positive outgrowth of this experience. Although the district followed through on it. Okay, in this community, a lot of things really began to change. I think '68 was the year that I was awarded an ESA by the JCs.
Mm-hmm.
Previous to that, Phil Davis. Phil Davis.
Yes.
Phil Davis was recognized, and I don't know if that's when he left to take that political job or not.
Well,
It was right around in that. It was right around in that time period.
Yeah, because
And then my friend, the year after I won that award, and then my friend, the year after I won that award, my friend, Reverend Willie Wright, won the same award. A year, I think it was the next year. So they were making this, I think it was the next year. So they were making this, this attempt to recognize contributions being made by some of us who are out here working all the time, with these various issues. I became the director of the neighborhood house in January 2nd as a direct attempt to address local social racial issues.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That was probably my most unwise professional move. Okay. But I did it helping my people.
Yeah.
And my community. And when I say my community, I don't mean the blacks. I'm talking about my community, Elmira.
Yeah.
Okay. But in order to do that, somebody had to take some of these responsibilities and at least give it a shot. Well, I literally ended up putting myself really in the middle of two communities. Neither this one said okay, this one was definitely said it wasn't okay. Okay, they would always, for 14 years, there was always a problem.
What were the two communities then?
Well, you had the black community or the minority community, but when you talked about the neighborhood house had its own community.
Yeah.
All right. And if you had a lot of time, I could tell you some of the things that I had to deal with because of that. Okay. The real issue was you had a multi-purpose community program. History of any social agency in the community. The charter takes it back to the 1800s. Okay.
Sure.
Okay. Which had traditionally served a integrated group of people, but in a segregated way. They won't admit it, but that's what was happening.
That's fascinating.
Okay. Just a quick example. When I took over the neighborhood house in 1970, they had all these programs. They had that building I had an armory in the basement. They had an armory in the basement. It had pool hall down there. It had wrestling rooms. It had 2 gyms. Had kilns, for
Pottery.
This facility had, for
Pottery.
This facility had anything in Community Center 1. It was an old, dilapidated, complex, right? So I ended up having responsibility of
Two, the conversation between Delmar Rouse and Ted Belsky on June 20th, 1991, for the Elmira Oral History Project. Del, you were telling me about the operation of the
Right.
neighborhood house.
Without going into an awful lot of detail about how this community center served a community, and the community was not restricted to the east side of Elmira.
Yeah,
It was a community center in almost the classical sense of the word,
yeah,
except that it served people in a relatively segregated way. Not segregated. Example,
yeah.
how many blacks would you think would need to know how to operate, have a water safety program? How many of us own boats? Gonna be
Yeah,
going
yeah.
out on, okay, none of us, right? So Saturday mornings, I go to work, see all these Cadillacs outside where they bring their kids in there to work. See all these Cadillacs outside where they bring their kids in there to get this water safety program, right? Okay. Or when it was time to get people had to get ready for their hunting.
Yes, sure.
Okay, they would come in and they'd take the go down to use.
Yes, sure.
Okay, they would come in and they'd take the go down to use the armory in the basement. Okay, the women would come in to do their crafts and to do upholstery, but these people were mostly white middle class people who lived on the other side of town. Okay, now that would be in the daytime. Okay, now that would be in the daytime, and then we had the preschool, we had the well baby clinic, and all these other things that emanated out of there. Okay, but when it got dark,
Then,
the inside got dark as well because all the blacks came in. Because then they could play the basketball. It was located on the east side.
sure.
Okay, and they didn't necessarily want to be over there on the east side at night.
Yeah.
Okay, it was across the street from a couple of the bars and the hangouts, and so that's how this program served a community. Okay, 1970, which was a very hot time across the country as far
Sure.
as racial attitudes were concerned. And the man that I replaced was doing a fine job. Okay.
Yeah.
He wasn't asked to leave because he wasn't doing the job, but because he was a white man. And he'd been there a long time. Okay? I mean, there were all kinds of innuendos are out there. And you can talk to 1,000 different people and get a different, But I know the first day I walked into my office, in the middle of my desk, I had people who were on my board of directors who had the letters of resignations there, and I never met them.
Yes, sir.
That's right. So I inherited this bear. Okay. That's right. So I inherited this bear. Okay. And I paid for it in a lot of different ways. But the point is that what could have been considered, and I'm going to put this in quotation, big quotation marks, a comfortable city to live
Yeah.
in the mid-60s, suddenly, because of the national issues, became uncomfortable because of allegiances that were being drawn and based on people.
Being redefined.
So what happened was that we now had a situation that was no longer one that people could anticipate what may or may not go, or what may or may not be acceptable. Okay? It's almost like I was saying to you about the flood. As long as the neighborhood house was there and black youths, for the most part, had their social and athletic activity in and around the neighborhood house, or as a result of the neighborhood house being their conduit.
Yeah.
Okay, that changed. It was located physically in our part of the community. So if you told your mom as a kid, I'm going to the nave, there was no problem. She knew where you would generally be, somewhere around the neighborhood house.
Yeah.
So that's what happened. Okay? After the flood, there was no residential community around the neighborhood house anymore. The east side had changed. I'm a young black, and I live over on the south side across the river.
For me, I'd spend most of my time after school going back and forth across the river. I would have no time to do anything once I got there. Okay? So a lot of things end up having to be redefined. And there were tremendous reluctance on the part of this community or in general
Yeah.
to really address that problem and to accept it. Just accept the need for that change to have to take place.
My hunch is there might have even been some reluctance.
Well, there was
because you're asking people to
yes, that's exactly what
create
happened.
new patterns of
That's
habits.
exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
People to,
yes, that's exactly
to
what
create
happened.
new patterns of
That's
habits.
exactly what happened.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly what happened, and there was a tremendous reluctance and resistance. It became almost impossible to put in place a agency program
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that would please both communities. Although financially they were dependent upon basically like the United Way to support it, because the major support for the agency came from that.
Sure.
Well, then
Sure.
it got to the point where the general community felt too much of their campaign money was going for this agency. Now they don't come out there and say that to you. When you're the exec and you cannot defend your program any longer, because they've always been coming up way through all this for 13 and a half years, okay? Never being able to satisfy either community.
Del, how long did the neighborhood house, when was the closing? 1981?
I don't know, 85,
Okay.
6
85,
something. Yeah.
86 maybe. 'Cause
Yeah,
I did
right.
see
I left
that.
there in 83.
Yeah.
Okay. But I left for different reasons than because of my health.
Right. No,
Yeah, but
right.
the point is that what happened to that agency is very reflective of what happened in the community in terms of how the changes would impact on the various systems,
Sure.
within the community.
Del, the other thing that I noticed as I was looking
Mhm.
through the literature is that it seems to me you had some very innovative projects come out of the neighborhood house.
Oh yeah, really worked
What-
at it.
What projects come out of the neighborhood house?
Oh yeah, really worked
What-
at it.
One was you had a drama group, or
The black and white teen
would
theater.
you describe that a bit?
Well, the black and white teen theater really is an outgrowth of the 60s. The original name of that group was the King's Ambassadors, after Martin Luther King. The original name of that group was the King's Ambassadors, after Martin Luther King.
Uh-huh.
And it was designed to be a message theater. And it was both black and white youth working together to promote, their feelings about what had taken place back then. And I had the help of people who gave a lot of their time and energy and expertise to make this happen. But that's what it was. It was a message theater
Mm-hmm.
that we eventually got funding to continue it from the New York State Council on the Arts. And they were so good that
Really?
we went down there. We were all over. We were the first groups in the prisons. We performed in the prisons. We produced an inmate play out here in the community. We just did a lot of things that were innovative, ahead of our time and ready for it. Not ahead of our time. Other people in other communities were there, but Elmira wasn't ready for this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I have some of those young people who were in my group at that time, who are now more subtle adults, are now wondering why can't this be reactivated. Are now wondering why can't this be reactivated, in terms of making something like that happen again for young people. You see, you got to have a real commitment to do that, because you have to battle on a lot of fronts to make that happen. But we did do that, and it was successful.
Yeah.
To make that happen. But we did do that, and it was successful.
Yeah.
By our standards and by other people's standards who were looking at us. But there were a lot of factors that made it hard to continue. Even some of the parents of our kids never understood what it was all about at the time.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but we did those kinds of things. We were like, as I said, we went into the prisons, which was unheard
That
of.
must have been,
Unheard of at that time. We went through a whole series of changes over that.
were you able to try out something different other than to take water safety training for, in other words, could you get your white community that were coming in to become involved in socially conscious projects?
Not to the same degree, no. But you see, the thing that was taking place that the white community was involved in at the time out of the neighborhood house were all for their personal, individual kinds of interests. Crafts, safety, those kinds of things. The Rotary Club, for example, had a room that we'll call it was labeled the Rotary Club room in the basement.
Yeah.
And they put money, because they also financed the summer camp for handicapped kids that emanated out of that.
So you had
And,
one of the,
My predecessor would also become camp director for
yeah.
my predecessor would also become camp director for that kid because he was a Rotarian. Well, I was a black man and I was not a Rotarian, okay? And eventually they came and asked for their money back. They had a lot of money. I mean, really, I had to go through a lot of changes. I eventually became a Kiwanian. I had to go through a lot of changes. I eventually became a Kiwanian.
Yeah.
But I didn't stay with it after, because it got to the point where they were asking me to do the same thing I was doing every day to work. In terms of getting involved in these various projects. And
sure.
God, I was all over every place, at that time, and I just couldn't carry it.
Being involved in a lot of different things.
Mhm.
You were in the school committee for a while.
I was on the school board for 5 years. That was the term at the time, the school
Yeah,
board
I think
term.
it probably still is. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I started,
Back
I
home.
went on in 72, unfortunately, because that was the year of the flood.
Yeah.
In fact, it was right after I started that the flood happened. It's interesting that in Elmira, you have it's sort of like a political thing. You got to run for office. And of all the candidates that ran that time, I was the second highest vote getter in the community. But my running mate owns Chapel Lumber Company. And he's part of the oldest members of our family in this community, the Hendy family.
Sure.
Okay, so we did very well, and I think that the fact that I had a broad-based support and I was known throughout.
Yeah,
Right.
But I can't remember if this comes out of a conversation that I had with you before, Del, or not, but your graduating year out of high school, I think it was
56.
56.
Mhm.
You thought, I'm aware that there was your graduation, but apparently, well,
Mhm.
would you develop that?
Well, in my class of 56, a number of the blacks coming out of that class
Mm-hmm.
throughout the country, several of us came back to Elmira to work.
Yeah.
That's probably what I was talking to you about, which was very unusual. There had been other blacks who've been
Sure.
gone on to college, but they would very unusual. There had been other blacks who've been
Sure.
gone on to college, but they would leave the community and fashion their careers outside the community. Most of them were very successful. But there were 3 black men who graduated with me, and we grew up together on the east side.
Who were they now?
Charles Prettyman and
What did
Tony
the-
Holmes. Now, those 2 men, one went to Geneseo, graduated from Geneseo. Tony Holmes graduated from Hobart.
Mm-hmm.
I was at Alfred, so we were all in this area, which wasn't that far. In fact, we were in still assembling the same conference. I used to see them when we played sports on the collegiate level. But they were both teachers.
Yeah.
Tony is still a teacher at Elmira Free Academy.
teaches history, I think it is. Chuck is the vice principal of Elmira Free Academy now, but he taught at Ernie Davis in science, earth science. And of course, I've been out here working as a human service. But the three of us came back to Elmira and spent, 20 plus years out here trying to affect some change, some more successfully, more openly than others. I mean, in terms of an overt way of going about it.
Sure.
Chuck is a much more low-key guy, overt way of going about it.
Sure.
Chuck is a much more low-key guy than I am. He works within the system, at the school system. He's worked his way up to where he is now the vice principal. Tony is still a teacher. Now he has principal. Tony is still a teacher. Now he has a different kind of approach to living. He also was the first black coach of the Academy football team.
Mm-hmm.
We've done some interesting things. Some things have happened. It's just that they're difficult to sustain. Chuck used to do some announcing of some of the football games for the radio and stuff like that, locally. Called Views from the East, where it was a host show, and I would bring in guests in order to try to make the general community more aware of issues, both black and white. And one of my shows that I did won the National Cable Award. So been out there, in terms of trying to affect a little change, and you don't really know how successful that is. You just go out there and you do the best you can. But you end up with a lot of scars. And, that's.
Del, before we bring this to a close,
Mhm.
you want to reflect on or compare or contrast the options for somebody from the black community, growing up in Elmira today. School-wise, how would you rate it?
Well, I think they have a much better chance now, much better opportunity. In order to set an educational or career goal for themselves, they can map it out a little bit more accurately than we could some years ago, I think. Okay. I also think that they're exposed to an educational system that better prepares them for the world that they're going to go out and meet. And that would be true for whether it's a black or a white youth, okay?
Yeah.
But because of that, that means that they can begin to select a direction. I think that the problems of coming back to this community to work professionally is still not very, very good.
Yeah, okay.
And I think their case is because, by and large, Elmira is not a very progressive community. It's conservative in its thinking. It's very reluctant to look realistically at change. You can see that happen around. You can see that happen around us, even with communities that are same size or smaller, are a lot more progressive in those kinds of areas, particularly the educational areas, and giving young people opportunities. So, like, you can go to Ithaca and see it happening more readily. You can go to Corning, or if the Ithaca and see it happening more readily. You can go to Corning, or Corning Glass is one of the nation's leaders at providing opportunities for minorities.
Yeah.
Okay, so that if you really put together an educational profile for yourself with a plan
and a direction, and you're a minority, you could really do well, okay? Which was not the case some years ago, you know.
Oh. He'd come listen to her preacher.
So I think from that point of view, you have better opportunity now, okay? Doesn't mean it's going to be any easier necessarily, but the opportunity was there, and it's not as hard to see where it's at.
Better counseling along the way?
I think that the counseling situation is one that goes even beyond racial kinds of things. I think numbers play a tremendous role. That there's always too few good counselors for the numbers of people that need counselors in order to get the kind of colleges that you want. Those that have the most money and power in the community still get the top. They get the first shot at anything. Okay, and that doesn't. When I was working with kids, I had just as many complaints or more from white parents. Parents would be saying, okay, and it's a numbers kind of thing that we're kind of unrealistic as almost as a nation, at least in our community. I'll put it in you know, where if you're a middle class family, you've been working with this goal to get your child into school, and you've been working toward that end. You don't want any constant saying, you got to wait until I can get to him. You don't want to hear that. Okay. Well, the black mother and father feels the same way. Okay. Even though the opportunity for the young people may not be as clear cut, or they may have not been working in the same way for as long. But once the child has decided that I want to go to college, they have that same kind of concern and that same kind of need for someone to respond in a realistic time to make it happen for them. And that realistic time to make it happen for them. And that doesn't happen all the time.
Dell, employment-wise, not only lower echelon, but middle management.
We're having a few inroads there now, but we're still way behind where we should be, based on a community who has had the kind of relationship with its black and whites.
Yeah.
For some responsibility, really given a responsibility. Okay. There are some avenues opening up. Okay. At a professional level, they're still way behind. We have no black doctors, no black dentists, no black lawyers size in this part of the country. We shouldn't have to say that. Okay. Even with the exception of Corning Glass, I think in the other industries, you may have some people, okay, that the company, I forgot the name, they got a different name. It's outgrowth of the Westinghouse in Toshiba. One of the owners of that is a black man. But he was But he was previously an employee of Westinghouse.
I see.
Kyle, his name. Yeah. But other than that, we're still way behind. We've spent a lot of years working in these various. We're still way behind. We've spent a lot of years working in these various industries, and we should be enjoying a little better rate in terms of how many are assuming response. Banking. We have one black man who is doing fairly well in banking now, Alex Gilliam at Chemung now. But he's about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
You
very
take guys
important.
like myself, Ernie Hemingway, Chuck, who've been out here years and years working, and yet we serve on no as any economic benefit to us,
Yeah.
even for your own expenses. You see what I mean? And it doesn't mean we don't have the experience, doesn't mean we don't have the intelligence or the education or the background. We don't have the opportunity because they never give it to us.
Okay.
People
Sure.
after a while, you know, you always ask me to do something because you know you can get it done. Okay. But when you think about doing it for, like serving on a bank board or a corporate board that in one of the business
Yeah.
areas, in one of the business
Yeah.
areas, it doesn't happen. Closest I came to it was when the mayor appointed me to his reconstruction committee after the flood. He had a 9-man committee. Everybody on the committee was a millionaire but me. Everybody on the committee was a millionaire but me. And this was in '72.
Yeah.
And we met at the city hall for our meetings. And the Urban Development Corporation of New York was coming in to help us, and this is what group that we were working with. And they were going to pay us for the meetings, and
Yeah.
these guys voted not to do it because they didn't need it. They didn't need this money to. Okay, so, or then when they would get through, and this was in '72. They would get through we get through the meetings in the evenings, street to the city club, which I couldn't go to. You see, I mean, you see, you get used years and years and years like that, you know, and you say, well, when people ask you about how you feel about some things, well, in '72, it was an honor to be asked to serve on that committee.
Yeah.
Later, okay, and you see that in reality, you really haven't moved that far.
Let me take you
Okay.
to two other areas.
Mhm.
What about housing? How open is housing?
Housing, for the most parts, appears to be more acceptable in terms of where you can go to find a
Yeah.
house. Now that's that's what it appears to be. I think when you start talking in terms of numbers and cost and
And then the
accessibility,
economics.
all right,
Sure.
then you're running that game that and
And then the
accessibility.
economics.
All right,
Sure.
then you're running that game that people play on.
Yeah.
You're going to pay a lot more for the property, and you're going
Uh-huh.
to get a lot less. There's still some areas that they would prefer us not to be in, and we're aware of that.
Yeah.
And that's probably
Okay.
going to still go on. But and we're aware of that.
Yeah.
And that's probably
Okay.
going to still go on. But as I said, because of the openness of our community in terms of open housing, brought on by the flood and everything
Sure.
else, some of those fears have been addressed,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that you don't hear an awful lot of difficulty in that area.
What about the law?
The law,
Hadn't
We
even talked about that before.
yeah. In what respect?
How good is the law courts? How equal are the law
Oh,
courts?
Lord. Ted, I don't know how to answer that one because it's difficult to, being a human service worker, being out here as long as I have, having worked in the prison in terms of counseling and all this other stuff, effectively, I think that there's some inequities with our system that we probably will never address in our lifetime. This community is a very good example of it, where we have two prisons. A very good example of it, where we have two prisons.
Mm-hmm.
We have inmates who are overwhelmingly in the minorities.
Absolutely.
They come from probably the most sophisticated city or metropolitan area in the world. Sophisticated city or metropolitan area in the world, not just in the
Yeah.
country, in the world. And they're being cared for by some of the people who really should not be there. And it just compounds the situation instead of helps it. Okay?
Yeah.
And then, okay?
Yeah.
And then once you start talking about what's just and legal, that changes when it gets into the court system. Okay? And there's kind of like a mentality about that you figure out what can and should be done about it.
Yeah.
But I don't think our legal system is a fair system across the board.
Yeah.
We could say that probably about a lot of things, but I think that's because it affects so many lives outside of transgress the laws of our society, their families and other people. But I just see a lot of things go on that raises a lot of questions in my mind about that.
It's to bring this interview to a proper close. There's a couple of other areas that I
Probably talked too much, Ted. I did.
no. Just means that there's more to talk through. But you have a sense of how thankful I was that you gave me your time. It really was a pleasure talking with you.
Very good.
I come away always understanding Elmira just a little bit better
Oh,
every
good.
time we have a chance to talk like this. And
Good.
for the thank you on behalf of them
You're very welcome.
as well as myself. Thanks, Del.